Welcome to Shadow of Truth with your host Dave Kranzler from investmentresearchdynamics.com and Rory Hall from thedailycoin.org. And we have a very special guest on the line today, Mr. Brian Burkhardt, and he is the publisher of fatalencounters.org, and he keeps track of what's going on with the police state USA. And Brian, he's been on CNN, Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, and his work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, the Huffington Post, and he's been on CCTV out of China, which is China's leading broadcast network. He's also the editor of Reno News and Review. And Brian, we'd like to welcome you to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, we're certainly glad you're here. Dave, why don't you kick us off here?
Yeah, so Brian, I really didn't even start thinking about police brutality and civilian related or civilian deaths related to encounters with the police. I knew about your website, but I just had never really started, looked into it. And then when the whole Baltimore thing hit the news, I was like, this seems to be a bigger problem than we're aware of. And so can you just tell our listeners a little bit about your website and what your project is?
Yeah, sure. Boy, how to start? I'll tell you how it started. 3 years ago, I was driving home from work and saw this scene of chaos with, a couple of dozen police cars kind of parked haphazardly around in this neighborhood, blocking the street off so you couldn't enter. And I just knew instinctively that that either a cop had died there or they'd killed somebody there. There was just something about it. So basically, I came home and did some research. I was trying to figure out how often that happens in Nevada or in the United States. How often do the cops kill somebody, And I started looking at the data that the federal government had in the Uniform Crime Report. And it became obvious very quickly that their data was spotty in some cases, completely missing in others. Entire states weren't included. I just kind of set it aside thinking, I'm just looking in the wrong place. But a few months later, there was another officer-involved homicide. And I dug my heels in and I figured I was going to figure out how often this happened. And I came across a story. The first one was at the Las Vegas Review-Journal. They had this series called Deadly Force. And in it, they said quite clearly the federal government doesn't track these numbers. And it was like a light bulb went off. The reason I couldn't find it wasn't because I'm no good at the internet. The reason I couldn't find it was because it didn't exist. And then I started researching that, and I found stories going back to the 90s with, like, the New York Times was complaining about the federal government not keeping this data. So it wasn't really a secret. It just wasn't talked about. But at that time, I decided that, when it happens, it's reported. Generally speaking, if a cop shoots somebody, it's reported in the media. And that's not 100% as I'm discovering now, but generally speaking, it's true. So I thought it was just going to be a question of, basically doing public records searches of the states. I mean, to simplify it, I thought I'd write 50 public records requests, for each state and get the information for the state and compile the database. Well, it turned out to be more difficult than that. Since the federal government wasn't collecting it, neither were most of the states. So then it turned out to be a question of doing public records requests of all state and local law enforcement agencies. And there were about 18,000 of those. And I want to make a kind of a long story short, because I asked the FBI for the addresses of all the state and local law enforcement agencies that contributed to the Uniform Crime Report. Instead of just answering it, they set up these Orwellian, I don't know how to describe it. They lied to me a bunch of times. I asked them, basically asked them for the mailing list for the agencies that contribute to the Uniform Crime Report. And their first response was, well, that doesn't exist. So they don't have to provide it. Well, I knew that was not true. So I made an even broader request. And the final result was about 8 months later, they sent me, they had printed out this database that doesn't exist. They'd printed it on 8 by, no, it was a spreadsheet that was designed to be printed on 8.5 by 14 sheets, but they printed it on 8.5 by 11 sheets. So the beginnings of the records weren't with the ends of the records. And then instead of giving me a PDF, they scanned it, they printed it, and then they scanned it into a JPEG. So it wasn't even searchable. I couldn't even scrape the information out of it. I would have had to hand type basically 18,000 addresses. In that 8 months while I was messing with the FBI, or they were messing with me to be more precise, I created this system, which was basically a Google form. And I went out and I scraped all the information I could find on, I think about 1,000 of these incidents where I had partial information. And I created a spreadsheet by which people could do the research, upload the information, I'd fact check it, it would go into the database. So basically, that's what Fatal Encounters is. It's a record of officer-involved homicides, not just shootings, but we include bludgeonings or chokeholds or vehicle, innocent bystanders shot, any incident that involves a law enforcement officer and a person dying as a result of that interaction.
Sounds like you had your hands full just trying to get things started.
It took me a couple years just to get the thing up and running. There was probably 8 months where I was messing with the FBI that I didn't move forward on this other part. But once I started that, it was I think I started that in April of 2013, and we launched it in February of 2014. And I think we had 500 incidents when we launched it, because I'd done public records requests of all the state and local law enforcement agencies in Nevada. Plus, I had 400 or 500 incidents that were culled from this other database spreadsheet I just described to you. So on February 27th of last year, we had about 500, maybe 600, and now we're up to just short of 7,000.
That's significant progress.
It's slow progress. We expect it's going to take us around 90 more weeks. We added about 100 a week, so about 90 more weeks before it's complete.
Brian, it sounds like the information is out there, but the various state and federal agencies are trying to make it as difficult as possible for you to get as accurate as possible information on police-related deaths. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't actually think that they're trying to make it difficult. I mean, there's a whole bunch of factors that feed into why this information doesn't exist on a national level. For example, if a cop shoots somebody in Kansas City, Missouri, that might be reported in the Kansas City newspapers, but it doesn't often catch the national attention. So it remains a local story. Now, as far as these public records requests we've been sending, since every agency has a different filing system, and we're not just asking for officer-involved shootings, for example, all these things are spread out. So we're going back to 2000. It's a lot of work for any agency. I mean, they have people whose job it is to manage these records, but it's still a lot of work. It makes it more difficult for them to cooperate with Fatal Encounters, but it also makes it more difficult for them to cooperate with federal agencies that are asking it, or even state agencies. While I do believe that there's kind of an attitude that these public records are not owned by the public, I don't believe there's like some conspiracy to keep this information from getting out. It was just a question of assembling it. And if one guy in Reno, Nevada can do it, the New York Times could have done it in 2005, or the federal government certainly could have done it going back to the to the 70s even.
Well, I guess where my question was coming from is you have a whole section on your website that talks about the Freedom of Information Act, and you have listed, which I found incredibly informative, and I can now understand why the government turns down FOIA requests in other applications. But do you think you've been stonewalled on reason? Forget the exceptions. Because a lot of those. Essentially, the way the whole thing reads is that if the government decides they don't want to honor your FOIA, they're not going to. Do you think you've been?
Yes, that's it in a nutshell.
Right. So, in that sense, I guess do you feel like you've been stonewalled and unreasonably in some of your applications for information under the FOIA?
Well, the one I just mentioned, I was perfectly entitled to have the database of the mailing list that I asked for. So yeah, they went way out of their way to prevent that information from getting out. It turned out I got it from a different source, also in the Department of Justice, but I didn't do a FOIA. I just called the lead statistician and asked for the information, and he sent it to me in a spreadsheet. It took like 2 weeks instead of battling to a stalemate with the FBI. So yeah, there's instances where I think they go way above and beyond the desire to get information out there to where they're actually trying to prevent information from getting out.
Well, I would think that it would be in the government's best interest for that information to not be out there. If we knew the truth, that people would be very upset and up in arms.
They are up in arms. They are upset anyway. Let's not say up in arms because that has a certain connotation. They are upset, but they're upset because the information was not getting out there, not because it was. And I think part of what upsets people is they want information and they think that information obviously must exist, and that makes them angry. And so, in various parts of the country where people believe that there were many rumors earlier on in this process that black men were being killed more than everyone else combined, which that's part of what ignited Ferguson, but it wasn't true, and the data doesn't support that. But you can see how people would get upset if that was the conventional wisdom at the time. They're hugely misrepresented, but it's not that they're killed at a higher rate than everyone else combined. They're killed at a higher rate than they're represented in society. But if we didn't have those numbers, we couldn't know that. So we couldn't and we're not really there yet. We only consider 2013 and 2014 to be complete. But until we started seeing where apparent racism existed, or where policies of high-speed car pursuits existed, or places where basically the grand juries never ever found an officer at fault, we couldn't know that until there was a database. So from my point of view, I would think that the government is glad now that this information is coming out, because they can adjust policies and hopefully prevent things like Ferguson by people knowing what the facts are.
But how do you prevent something like the situation in Cleveland with Tamir Rice, where the police simply pull up, all on closed circuit TV? Police pull up. There's a 12-year-old child. He's playing with a BB gun in the snow at a park, and the police pull up and murder this child, period. He opens the door of the police car, gets out, fires at least one shot, and the child drops. That is what bothers me more than anything. And now this officer has been charged, which he should be. That's one of the things that I think that bothers people more than anything.
Yeah, well, if you look at about 7,000 of these things, you see that it's not that unusual. What was unusual about it was that it caught the American imagination, and it only caught the American imagination because it happened while Ferguson was going on.
Yes.
I mean, the ones that bother me is where the person is handcuffed in the back seat of a police car with his hands cuffed behind him, who somehow produces a gun and shoots himself in the front of the head. I'm not exaggerating. If you would give me 2 seconds, I could tell you 3 names where that happened. And in every case, the officers were found. The shooting was found accidental, or justified or excusable, depending on what jurisdiction it is, how they describe it. So it wasn't 6 months before Tamir Rice. There was a kid, I believe it was in Santa Rosa. He wasn't even close enough to hear the officers if they had told him to drop it was one of those airsoft things.
Yeah.
And I think he was 13. But if you look at the age range of on in the database on the website, you'll see that it'll just break your heart. I mean, many of these children killed for the most tenuous of reasons.
What do you think has happened to our police in this country? I mean, we know that the militarization with them getting the equipment that was in Iraq last week or in Afghanistan last week that they are now carrying, it's now part of their everyday equipment. I mean, what is that part of it, or what has happened? Because, I mean, when I was growing up, I'm 53. This is not the same police that I grew up with at all. What happened in your opinion?
I think a lot of this stuff goes back to fear. It's like, yes, we've militarized our police since September 11th, 2001. We've changed their training in that they're, more aggressive. I mean, I don't really know how much the actual, military weapons has to do with this, as much as things like SWAT teams who are designed to be on the aggressive side. We know a lot more about when cops are set up and killed. We know a lot more about people killed by police than we did even a couple years ago, and that creates kind of this feeling of fear between the cops and the people they're supposed to be protecting. So both sides. Like if you look at last August, there was a spike in these incidents because both the person who's being pulled over or interrogated by police is more afraid, and the cops are more afraid because they're seeing what's in the media. So I don't know. There's so many factors to why this is increased. I mean, I think the militarization of police has a lot to do with it, but I think you and I are both 53, so the way the training has changed in the last 30 years, I think that's all factors.
I guess it just sort of seems to me that, and I don't know if I necessarily tie it directly to the 911, 911 is the anchor date, but it seems like, especially in the last couple years, there's been an increase in police aggression toward the public. Clearly, the militarization of the police is part of it. And the reality is the police are supposed to be protecting us from the bad guys. And instead, I don't feel like, whenever I see police now, I almost feel threatened. And I shouldn't feel like, or I feel like, I might be at risk for something. And it seems like part of the biggest problem with these cops going around and shooting people and killing them. I mean, whatever happened to the concept of habeas corpus? What happened to innocent before proven guilty? I mean, we saw the cases in both Ferguson and Baltimore where they gunned down these guys, and these guys didn't even have a chance at getting a trial before a jury to determine if they were guilty of whatever the cops thought they were guilty of.
Right, and the media is part of what kind of promotes that message. Like you'll see and reported, even if the guy's a bad guy, like a previous sex offender, or something that indicates that they're not a nice human being, somehow that's an excuse for the cops to do these extrajudicial executions. going back to what you said, that you didn't tie it back to 911, the reason I tie it back to 911 is because the two wars that provided the military weapons that have militarized the police came as a result of that event. That's why I tie it back to that.
That's fair enough. But just in my observation, and again, you haven't had a chance to sort of tell us the statistics, the number of police-related deaths that I think you said you have 2013 and 2014 complete. And I was shocked when I was going through your website and I saw what is now considered the estimated number of police-related deaths per day. But it just seems to me that there's been, especially in the last, probably since, I would say since the great financial collapse in 2008, there's been a definite increase in the application of the police state and a definite decrease in respect for our constitutional rights.
I think that's true. And I think part of it is, if you're looking for something that all these people have in common, I mean, many people look to race. We're also seeing mentally ill people make up about 30% of the people killed by police. So really, I think the biggest overall factor is poverty. So if after that financial collapse created more poor people, it makes sense that those numbers would increase, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just tell you, as far as 2014, we have 1,184, and for 2013, we have 1,126. Every year that goes back from real time, our numbers are going to get spottier and spottier, just because it's the nature that people purge newspapers purge their archives over a certain date. There wasn't mass. I mean, even in 2000, I don't know what percentage it was, but it was probably closer to 50% of newspapers were online, as opposed to virtually 100% now. So I don't know. We expect our numbers will be good going back to 2005 or so, but they get really sketchy beyond that.
So essentially, it sounds like, and this is a number that would have shocked me, because I can guarantee you, if you go out and randomly poll 100 people at your local shopping mall and ask them how many people a day do you think are killed in police-related killings, it's a little over 3 a day. So about one every 8 hours. One person every 8 hours.
I wrote an article a few months ago, Brian, and the title of it was "Who's the Real Killer?" And I wasn't aware of your website at the time, and the information that I pulled from was a website called Killed by Police, killedbypolice.net, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. And I cross-referenced that with officerdownmemorialpage.com. The numbers bear out exactly what you're saying right there. And as of April the 10th of this year, there had been 319 people killed by police in this country. On the flip side of that, there had been 0 police killed by hostile attacks. There was a total of 13 police who had died in the first 44 days of 2015. They were all from accidents or illness, heart attack, that kind of thing. None of them from hostile fire at all, not one. And it just seems that the numbers are increasing as the days go by. And I originally penned this article back in February, and at that time, on February the 18th, there had been 131 people killed. By April the 10th, it had increased to 319. And if you take the 131 and divide it by the days and by the hours, you come up with right at 8 hours, every 8 hours for a person killed. By April the 10th, it had dropped to 7.5 hours. So I'm not sure where it's at this point, how many people have been killed by police at this point, and if that number is still dropping. I mean, are you looking at statistics from that perspective as well? I mean, because it seems like everything's getting ramped up.
We don't actually collect on real time, because some things we look at, like whether the grand jury or the district attorney or whomever has found it justified, that usually doesn't come out for weeks and sometimes months. So we usually say we try to stay within about a month. However, to answer your question, yes, if there's increased awareness about this situation, if it's true that increased awareness breeds kind of fear, then it makes sense that it would increase. To me, it makes sense.
Well, Brian, you've been very generous with your time, and this has been exploring this whole subject has been a real eye opener for me. And I would have never guessed that there was one person killed in a police related killing every 7.5 or 8 hours. I just would have never in my wildest dreams had thought it was that many, and it turns out that it is. Can you tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and your project, your database project?
Oh, I think the best place to go is just onto the website at fatalencounters.org. And if you go under tools, it gives you a bunch of different ways to explore the information. Name check and database. You can check the database for things like age or mental illness or where it happened, down to counties. There's like 7 different ways to check.
I also think, I guess you're also considered people can make tax-free donations to your efforts.
Yeah, we are a 501c3. It's kind of funny because once we got kind of famous, donations just dropped off because I think they assume that we're some big organization, but it's mainly me and a few volunteers, and so we're paying. I don't know. There's 6 or 8 people who do directed research for me, and we pay them $3.50 an incident. So yeah, if you could encourage your fans to throw some money our way, it will definitely be put to good use.
If you do have some spare change laying around, please consider making a donation to fatalencounters.org. And it is tax deductible, which will allow you to get some of your money back that the government steals from you by way of the IRS. Brian, I really want to tell you how much I appreciate all your time that you've shared with us and our audience, and I hope that we can do this again in the future.
Oh, sure. Give me a call anytime.
You got it.
Yeah, I'm thinking at some point down the road, in the next several months, we'll check back in to get an update on the numbers and see if you've been able to draw any more inferences out of looking at the data.
Yeah, we're just doing the FOIA for I don't know, something like 90 federal police agencies. So I think I'll have some real good new insights probably within a matter of a couple months for sure.
Well, everybody be good, and we'll talk with you soon.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thanks, Brian.
Bye-bye.
Sure.